Well, thank you very much, Robin, for your kind introduction. And I also wish to thank Barry White for the opportunity to speak at this very important and also very timely symposium. It seems that suddenly the door has been opened to quickly advance the objectives that a symposium like this has. And though there is a very diverse group of people here who come from a wide range of perspectives, one thing that we all share is a passion, and we all value water and care about the future. And I sense a new spirit emerging as a result of calling of this meeting. In my view, the alignment of new political interests combined with a growing number of Canadians who have witnessed firsthand the climate disruptions that have been happening in the last 5 years could make the next 4 years the most transformative period in the history of this country with respect to changing attitudes toward the value of water and water-related resources to our economy and our way of life. And it seems to me, too, at least, that in the last 10 years we haven't had the same kind of opportunity to openly share new knowledge and tools for advancing watershed stewardship in quite the way that we will today. In a way, I feel like today we are re-energizing our efforts to get sustainability right, that we really are genuinely working toward the same ends, and that we're going to get there this time. And I'm both honored and thrilled to be here. Now, for those who don't know me, please allow me to explain that the goal of my work with the UN is to build a better bridge between science and public understanding and policy action and water and climate issues in Canada. And one of the principal roles of our initiative is to bring national and international example to bear on Canadian water and water-related climate concerns. My principal focus is on water security, and as everyone at this gathering knows, water security used to mean having and being able to reliably provide adequate water of the right quality where and when you need it for all purposes, especially agriculture, but also for purposes related to sustainable, natural, biodiversity-based Earth system function. It also used to mean ensuring that your use and management of water in the region in which you live does not in any way negatively affect the water security of regions up or downstream from you now or in the future. And I think it's important to say that water security still means all of these things, but changing circumstances now mean that there is an additional element of water security that must now be considered. And over the last decade, water security has also come to mean being able to achieve these goals, not just in the face of growing populations and competing pressures, but also in the face of new circumstances created by the acceleration of the global hydrologic cycle. And what I'm describing here is what I call the storm after the calm, after a period of relative hydroclimatic stability during which we created most of our built environment. Step-like changes to our hydroclimatic circumstances are demanding that we redefine what development and sustainability mean, not just in Canada, but globally. This in turn demands that we reassess personal and collective vulnerability, accountability, and liability, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances if we want to sustain our prosperity in the face of altered hydroclimatic conditions. And what such reassessment reveals is that water security, food security, and climate security are inseparable. One is implicit in the other. It could even be said that they're the same thing. And as everyone in this room knows, water, food, and climate security are critical elements of sustainability. Without stable water and climate regimes, sustainability will forever remain a moving target. But if you're at this symposium, you also know that flood resilience is very much an element of a larger water security ideal. And this makes forest management, especially in upland regions, a critical factor in any water and climate security formula. Now, these are old ideas in a sense, but they're made new again in the context of emerging politics of hydrometeorological change. And in order to see where all this might be going, it may be helpful to examine how these politics of hydrometeorological change emerged and how they've evolved. While not directly related to climate change, the issue of urban flood resilience at the time appeared on our radar just after the UN Water for Life decade was initiated 10 years ago. And what happened in New Orleans just simply couldn't be ignored. And while the media and most public attention focused on the failure of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the culpability of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the disaster, what we looked at were the broader implications of the disaster. We examined the implication of a projected increase in the vulnerability of big cities to longer, more frequent, and ever more intense flooding events that were expected over time as a consequence of human-caused changes in the composition of the global atmosphere. And what we found was that while the initial focus was on the huge cost of repairing the damage to the city, the real cost, the deeper cost that went largely uncalculated, was the permanent physical and psychological impact on those who survived Katrina and its aftermath. And really, it's taken us a decade to sort out just how serious that damage really was and remains. And if you're interested in the larger issues related to the sustainability of our society in a changing climate, and haven't read this book, I really urge you to do so. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, sections of New Orleans were uninhabitable for weeks. And the hospital medical center at which Sherry Fink worked was an island in the center of the flood zone. And when the power went out in the city, backup generators couldn't keep up with the air conditioning, and eventually the lights failed. And helicopters could only take 1 or 2 of the 2,000 people that needed to be evacuated at a time. And the ethical question became, well, who do you evacuate first? How do you prioritize who lives and who dies? And in the aftermath of this disaster, some doctors and nurses were charged with murder. And what this example demonstrates is that the moral jeopardy that arises in the aftermath of extreme weather events is really similar to that which arises in war zones, where it becomes impossible to adhere to established moral values. And that, I'm afraid, is the larger terrain we're entering with respect to extreme weather events. And Katrina was followed, most interestingly, by nearly a decade of the foreshadowing of the flooding disaster that later we experienced here in southern Alberta. You know, you'll remember there was flooding in Alberta in 2005, both events, of course, within natural variability. But this was also followed by flooding widely throughout Europe and the Northern Hemisphere almost every year following. And then in 2010, we began to see mega floods, events that occurred in Australia and Pakistan so large they'd never been experienced before. There was a mega flood on the Canadian prairies in 2011, and it was clear then to many that there was something going on out there, that the hydrologic order was changing. But we didn't really have the evidence to prove it. But then suddenly we did. In the fall of 2011, John Palmer, I will speak to you later, and researchers at the University of Saskatchewan showed evidence that was really confirmed by a major report almost simultaneously released by the National Research Council in the United States that proved that the global hydrologic cycle is, in fact, accelerating. And the report confirmed how serious the loss of hydrologic stability could be in North America and around the world if current trends persist. And the findings of the National Academy's analysis include consensus on the fact that anthropogenic land cover changes such as deforestation, wetland destruction, urban expansion, dams, irrigation projects, and other water diversions have significant impact on the duration and intensity of floods and droughts. And the report concluded that continuing to use the assumption of stationarity in designing water management systems is in fact no longer practical or even defensible. So in other words, the old math and the old methods no longer work, and continuing to use them will in time become legally indefensible. And the significance of the loss of hydrologic stationarity, in my mind, is only beginning to sink in. And my experience globally right now is that at present, action in support of true sustainability and resilience in the face of hydroclimatic change is moving along at 5 kilometers an hour. Well, the problem is moving at 19 kilometers an hour and accelerating. So we need to catch up while we still can, and I think that's what this symposium is about. Because of the increased number and growing costs of climate-related disasters, more and more people in this country and elsewhere are really concerned about resilience. And the growing interest coincides with a critical time in the global dialogue concerning the sustainability of human presence on this planet. We face a number of cumulative and compounding human effects that at present make sustainability a moving target. We need to stabilize these effects if we don't want adaptation and resilience to constantly be beyond reach. The problem, as all of you know, is that our numbers, needs, and activities globally are such that we have begun to undermine the planetary conditions upon which we depend for the stability of environment and economy that are the foundation of our prosperity. And 9 Earth system boundaries have been identified as critical in the extent that they are not crossed marks the safe zone. And of these 9 boundaries, we appear to have already crossed 4. So careful examination of how our hydrology is changing and how little the public understands the significance of these changes suggests that if we want to create resilience, we may have to reframe the situation. And one way our current situation is being reframed globally is through the notion that we have entered a new geological era in which human activities rival the processes of nature itself. So, what is this new geological epoch, and how different is it from geological periods of the past? Well, this new geological period is being called the Anthropocene, and unlike earlier epochs in the Earth's history, which were brought about by meteorite strikes and other geological events which resulted in mass extinctions, this epoch is marked by our overall impact on the Earth system, and climate disruption is only one of the Earth system boundaries that mark the safe zone we must stay within if we want a prosperous future. So what we see from this is that by virtue of our numbers and our activities, we've altered the global carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. We're causing changes in the chemistry, salinity, and temperature of our oceans and the composition of our atmosphere. And changes in the atmosphere, in tandem with land use changes and our growing water demands, have altered the global water cycle. And the cumulative measure of the extent to which we have crossed these boundaries is the rate of biodiversity loss. So what this means is that we've entered an era in which we can no longer count on self-willed, self-regulated natural landscapes to absorb human impacts on Earth system function. And whether we like it or not, we have to assume greater responsibility for staying within these Earth system boundaries. These, however, are not matters that people want to talk about. And I've said so many times before, one of the big challenges we faced over the past 10 years is that outside gatherings like this, there's been a real silence, even around the silence related to these kinds of concerns. And the silence is beginning to attract a lot of attention, if only because it's going to be very difficult to become resilient as a society to threats that the public doesn't believe or want to believe exist. And in my view, we should not be fooled into thinking that suddenly Canadians are going to act on the climate threat simply because we have a new federal or provincial government. It's not that easy. It's one thing to change people's attitudes, quite another to change their behavior. And we as a society are deeply entrenched in habits and expectations that have been centuries in the making. And it's human nature not to want to lose that which once possessed now possesses us. And our way of life is something that we don't want to give up. And while Canadians have elected a government that's at least prepared to admit federally that the climate is changing, the conversation over what we have to do, the change and sacrifices that we're going to have to make, it's not going to be an easy one. And as everyone in this room knows, there's a lot of resistance out there. So why can't we talk about it? Well, researchers have found that some people don't want to talk about climate disruption because they just don't see it where they live. It's one thing to intellectualize water-related climate effects, and it's quite another thing to experience them directly. Others don't want to talk about climate disruption because they just don't believe it's happening and never will, and these are the true deniers. And another source of denial relates to the nature of science itself, and in particular the scientific method, which the public doesn't understand. And if you don't understand the scientific method, it's easy to be distrustful of science, especially when it publicly expresses certainty about projections that don't materialize, such as the highly publicized 1990s projections that we're about to enter a new ice age. And still others don't want to accept climate disruption because they don't like or trust the people who are sounding the alarm. They simply don't share the same views or values, and they definitely don't trust environmentalists. And this is a serious issue, and this is something we can't ignore. Others deny climate change because they ideologically oppose the extent of the presence and influence that government would have to address a problem that can clearly only be resolved through common cooperative action and sacrifice. And it's really important to note that ideological issues related to climate disruption don't end there, as we've witnessed over the past decade here in Canada. Until October 19th, even human rights groups were afraid to speak out on climate change for fear of government disapproval of their reasons for existing. And so what you can see in this is that in such circumstance, what you arrive at is a conspiracy of silence that favors misinformation. Research also demonstrates that there are many out there who want to talk about climate disruption because they're either consciously or unconsciously troubled by the moral, ethical, or legal implications of not having acted on what they know. And as was the case in the Memorial Hospital in New Orleans, the central factor that determines moral and hence legal responsibility is intention to harm. And at the outset of the climate debate 40 years ago, it was unthinkable that anyone would harm anyone else by consciously altering the climate. But now with 5 IPCC assessment reviews before us and clear evidence of climate disruption on the television news every night, it's getting hard for certain interests to claim that they didn't know and still don't think they are causing harm. And this is turning into an interesting situation. Now, the question becomes this: at what point does willful blindness become negligence? And at what point does negligence become a crime? And what's really interesting is that investigations such as the one the Attorney General of New York has initiated into climate change denying activities of ExxonMobil are not related to the impacts of climate disruption per se. They revolve instead around whether or not the corporation's executive withheld important information they possess from shareholders regarding the potential performance of the company and the true value of its assets, a world in which continuing burning of fossil fuels could potentially make the planet uninhabitable. So what I'm telling you here is that legal issues with respect to climate impacts are not going to go away. And we see something else happening. The public trust doctrine, which holds that certain resources are owned by all and available to all, is also gaining legal force. And a growing legal movement in the direction of a constitutional right to a livable environment is demanding that governments fulfill their restorative duty, which will mean that governments will not just be charged with preventing future damage, but will have a fiduciary responsibility to repair past harms that scientists now identify as threatening to current and future generations. So clearly, the silence over such matters is not going to last. And the reason, you all know it, it's obvious hydrometeorological change, impacts that the average person is beginning to see with their own eyes. And according to the 8th annual RBC Canadian Water Attitude Survey in 2015, Canadian attitudes are actually starting to shift, but only very, very slowly. But this survey reveals that barely half of Canadians even know where their water comes from. Fewer still know that our hydrology is changing, and most Canadians remain complacent about climate change. So where is this possible shift I mentioned? Well, here it is. The 2015 survey found that 7% of Canadians were personally affected by flooding in 2014, and 27% knew someone personally affected during that same year. So the point that I want to make here is that it's just going to be a matter of time before the growing number of people personally affected by climate disruption forms a constituency of its own right, and that the moral, ethical, and legal implications of climate disruption will likely be very high on the political agenda of this constituency. So stay tuned. And what I'm worried about, and I have to say this honestly, because this is one of the things that we have to keep in mind as people who care and also know about these matters. What we are worried about is that the climate issue could potentially tear our society apart. And what we have to avoid is falling pell-mell, every man for himself, into a future we neither intended nor desire. And really, it's the duty of everyone in this room to prevent that from happening. And we're not going to be able to keep the undeclared civil war we're trying to contain secret much longer. And again, it goes back to this whole problem of hydrometeorological change. And the problem is that the way things are going now, we will not be able to afford the costs to our economy of ignoring our changing circumstances. And that means we have to rethink sustainability. And that's why this symposium really matters. Despite inherent tensions among them, the next iteration of global sustainable development goals and targets must create a safe operating space within the Earth system and social boundaries. And in responding to the urgency and opportunity of getting sustainability and sustainable development right, the United Nations last month announced a new framework for global action. The 2030 Transforming Our World Agenda promised to be the most comprehensive and inclusive effort to positively change the world and all of human history. This may be the most important thing we've ever done for ourselves and our planet. It's nothing less than a charter for people and the planet in the 21st century. And what this agenda does is it raises the ceiling on sustainability. And as such, I think it's as important as pending climate negotiations in Paris in that it deals with the damage we're doing to other elements of the Earth system that are exacerbating and being exacerbated by climate change. And the 2030 agenda is constructed around 5 themes: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And interestingly enough, it applies equally to the developed world as it does to developing nations. And our hope for achieving sustainable development globally resides in a balance between urgency, capacity, and the will to succeed as demonstrated by each and every UN member state. And it's at the national levels that these goals must be met. So the degree of our success will depend on governance, by which I mean the way in which authority is organized and executed in a society. So translating the global sustainable development agenda action at the national level is the greatest challenge we now face in dealing with the degree of hydroclimatic change we're now witnessing on a planetary scale. So in other words, we won't achieve the goal of sustainable human existence at any meaningful level of prosperity unless we all take common goals, global goals seriously and implement meaningful and measurable actions at the national level in every country in the world. And this means there can't be any laggards, particularly in the developed world. And also means that we can't leave anybody behind. So where do you think Canada stands in all this? Well, that just changed. And often in social movements, timing is absolutely everything. And the world is about to reach out and steady itself. So now's the time. There's still room to move, but we have to move now while that room exists. And one of the ways to re-energize the conversation about sustainable development and humanity's need for resilience in the face of rapid change is to talk about something that none of us can live without: water. Of the 9 Earth system boundaries we dare not cross, water plays a significant role in 7. There are 17 goals in the Transforming Our World Agenda. Goal 6 pertains specifically to water. The world learned from the Millennium Development Goals that we need to better address the multiple roles water plays in establishing, maintaining, and improving the human condition. Creating a systems approach to managing water has to be seen as synonymous with sustainability and resilience. Now, there is then the not insignificant matter of cities. Some 92% of the population growth, which has brought the last 1.2 billion people into the world, has occurred in cities. And some 60% of the urban space required to accommodate future populations has yet to be built. And what we see is Sustainable Development Goal 11 aims to make the world's cities and human settlements inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And the vision is that by 2030, sustainable, resilient cities will significantly reduce the number of deaths and the economic and psychological effects caused by disasters, including water-related catastrophes. So the target is that as early as 5 years from now, we will have substantially increased the number of cities and human settlements adopting and implementing plans to mitigate and adapt to climate change and enhance resilience to disasters. 5 years. That's not much time. And by 2030, we want to reduce the adverse per capita impacts of cities on surrounding regions. Now, I spend a lot of time traveling in rural Canada, as many of you also do, and I can say that with considerable confidence that most city dwellers would be very surprised with what is going on out there in the name of urban prosperity. And the concept of sustainable development, in my view, has been badly abused in this country because it has lacked clear, commonly held definition and time frames. The concept of sustainable development has become, in my mind, sort of like elevator music to which we all march down the road together thinking we're actually doing something that's not being mocked and overshadowed by population and economic growth. And it all sounds terrific until someone starts asking divisive questions about where exactly we're going. So, deteriorating Earth system function makes it very clear that if we don't take sustainable development seriously, we could find ourselves on a planet whose conditions are hostile to human habitability as we know it today. So we're faced with the realization that if we're to achieve any meaningful level of sustainable development, all development has to be not only sustainable, but restorative. And we need to recognize that no city can become truly sustainable and resilient unless the landscapes around it are managed sustainably also. And this means we have to master basin-scale integrated watershed management. It also means we have to stop ignoring the growing impacts of industrial agriculture. And it's no secret that over the past 50 years, farming in this country has come to be largely controlled by the demands of machinery rather than the nature of agricultural lands. And the stream channelization that's necessary to create uninterrupted landscapes that allow the use of ever larger equipment not only concentrate nutrient flows that are becoming a cause of eutrophication of lakes and watercourses, as evidenced by algal blooms of up to 17,000 square kilometers in Lake Winnipeg. Excess nutrient flows also complicate water treatment in neighboring municipalities and dramatically increase the threat of downstream flooding. Now, this is important. At the risk of disagreeing with one another, we have to talk about these things, and this should not be an us versus them proposition. We cannot let agriculture fail. Nobody disputes that. If agricultures fail, our cities fail. But we also need clean water and protection from flooding. The fact remains, however, if we want our cities to be resilient, or if we want anywhere else to be resilient, we not only need to change practices in agriculture, but change fundamental agricultural principles. Agriculture must become restorative as well as productive. And what we see here is the concepts of agroecology have to transform agriculture. We need a transformation to occur by 2030. And what we may need is another agricultural revolution, one in which society agrees to pay farmers not just for the crops they grow, but for perpetuating critical Earth system functions over the ever-expanding lands now under agriculture globally. And we know which direction we should head. Rebuilding soils as a means of enhancing natural processes of water purification is now viewed once again, as it was a century ago, as smart urban planning. And that's why 200 cities in 29 countries have forgone building new water treatment plants and instead invested in watershed restoration that prevents downstream pollution while at the same time enhancing flood protection. But the soil does something else besides grow forests, supply food, and absorb and purify water. It stores carbon. And it's now estimated that we've already lost as much as 80 billion tons of carbon from our soils through inappropriate agricultural practices and short-sighted land use globally. And current IPCC warming projections, based on the increased carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, resulting in greenhouse emissions, don't as yet take the effects of warming of the world's soils into full consideration. It appears, however, that these feedbacks could be absolutely substantial. there is about 4 times more carbon sequestered in the top 20 centimeters of our planet's soil as there now is in the atmosphere. And a warming of only 2 degrees would cause 25% of the soil carbon of the topsoil to burn off as carbon dioxide, and that amount would be equal to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere as a result of burning fossil fuels. So what I'm telling you is if we warm the world's soils by 2 degrees C, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere could double from its present 400 parts per million to 800 parts per million. So what you see from this is keeping carbon in the soil, therefore, may be one of humanity's most important priorities. So we need smart agriculture, which is to say we need to seek to increase productivity while at the same time reducing greenhouse emissions and also increasing resilience. We're concerned here too about forests, and I think if you work for Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, you're working in service of addressing one of humanity's most difficult sustainable development goals, and that goal is nothing less than to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. And I think this is critically important because it also demands that we sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and end biodiversity loss. So if we are to be sustainable as a society, forestry must be storative in terms of carbon and restorative in terms of Earth system function. And I want to just conclude by saying that there's a bit of a red cream. This is why the theme of COP21 is later it will be too late. And so therefore there's urgency, and this provides urgency to this seminar. I'm reminded also of the Red Queen effect in biology, which is used as a metaphor for the evolutionary principle that regardless of how well a species adapts to its current environment, it must keep up with its competitors and enemies who are evolving also. And I think that this allusion to Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass is interesting in that it suggests that you have to run twice as fast to stay in the same place. And the Red Queen effect is very much applicable to what we're dealing with climate effects. Do nothing, you fall behind, or run hard and just stay where you are. So we now have the chance to move beyond this, and what I think we need to do is to keep up and then get ahead of the most important trend of our time, which is the Keeling Curve. And what I want to say in conclusion, what we're engaged in is nothing less than the struggle to redefine our dominant mythology. And I believe that out of sheer necessity, we will adapt, we will become more resilient as a society, and we should never lose sight of the fact that the potential also exists to create a better world, and that better world starts with water. And I'm honored and privileged to work with people of your caliber to help create that world. Thank you very much.